We sometimes don't even realize it. The fact that you and I are able to do this, and then people from across the world in principle can actually chime in and listen into this, is a product of science and technology.
What is it like in that absolutely crazy environment to work amongst scientists? What would a student expect on such a program?
Just expect to be blown in your mind. That is what happened to me. I've never been to Ladakh. I'd never been to Ladakh prior to this expedition.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to yet another live Q&A session. I'm Siddharth Pandey at Amity University, Mumbai. And with me, I have Dr. Sudha Rajamani from ESEP, Pune. Hi, Sudha. How are you?
I'm good, Siddharth. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Such a pleasure to talk to you at all points whenever we cross paths. And now we are again here at that same moment 5 years back when we were planning to get ourselves to Ladakh.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of good memories.
A lot of good memories. So, Sudha, let's dive straight into it. There's a lot of students and people who are interested in astrobiology, but they don't know where to start. And there's very few people in India who have made that journey. So tell us a bit about yourself, your background, where did you grow up, and how did you find yourself into this current distinguished chair of associate professor at ESEP Pune doing astrobiology work?
So I would classify myself as a science enthusiast. I've always been one all my life. Wanted to know, always knew that I'd wanted to do something and learn about how things work. There's been this incessant curiosity about trying to understand why plants of a certain kind have a certain leaf shape versus the other, so on and so forth. So I've been a science geek all my life. Yeah. So where did I grow up? I'm a Hyderabadi by association, geological association. I grew up in Hyderabad, but I've been places because I did my master's in Madras University in Guindy in Madras, and I did my PhD in NII in New Delhi. So I kind of have been places, and after this journey of sort of moving different states within India, I kind of went to the US, and I lived both on the West and East Coast for about 10 years pursuing a postdoctoral fellowship. A little bit of a background here. I am a biochemist by training. So I've done, I had really crappy math teacher for 2 consecutive years in 6th and 7th grade. So I very happily dropped math after 10th, which is a big mistake. And I don't think anybody should do that. Please continue to like math and please continue to do math because it features in every aspect of science. I went on to do a triple major in my BSc, which is in microbiology, chemistry, and zoology. And then I did my master's in life sciences. And I got very intrigued by immunology as a science, as a field of science. And I thought, I want to be associated with a lab to do my PhD in translational immunology, whatever that means. Basically, I wanted to be associated with a project that sees immediate translation. But, you come with very naive notions of what research is, of what a kind of translational research timescales, what are the kind of timescales that are involved, so on and so forth. And the only person in NII who was then doing immunology that was sort of in the translational realm had actually left NII. So I was left with a bunch of choices when I was like, what is it that I want to do? I kind of love to understand how molecules work within our cells. It's always been a big fascination for me. So I was like, when I say immunology, it becomes a class of specified molecules. So I just zoomed out and said, I'd like to work with any molecule and understand molecular level functions of different sort of families of molecules, so on and so forth. So I started looking at the labs that were available to me, and in a very not very super planned sort of a way, I joined Dr. R.P. Roy's lab, where I worked on sickle cell anemia. Basically, this is the first genetic disorder that was identified in the early 50s, and to date, there has not been very systematic sort of treatments available. The only one thing that has come really close, and it's in the very exploratory stages, is a CRISPR-based technology, and it's showing very promising results. But while I was there, I got super interested in protein aggregation disorders in general. And these are the same kinds of problems that happen in people that develop Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So when I wanted to do my postdoc, I figured I'll move to one of these labs. And I came to the US to Tony's lab, where I worked on Parkinson's for a handful of years. And in a very, again, unplanned sort of way, driven by funding-related problems, I was almost on the verge of coming back to India when a dear friend of mine kept bugging me to go and talk to his boss. about a position in his lab. So I was like, he does astrobiology. It is mind-blowing. It is super cool sounding. And it is something that appeals to all of us. We all want to know how is it that we came about. So I thought these were all sort of very philosophical realm questions. And I didn't know that you could systematically pose hypotheses and come up with logical experiments to answer these questions. And then I was like, why would he want somebody with a biochemistry background? He was like, no, go and talk. So I finally went and talked. Long story short, Dave was looking for somebody with my background, and I landed that position. I spent about over 4.75 years with Dave, and it was a brilliant journey. Fell in love with the field of astrobiology. Essentially, astrobiology is the science that deals with the origins, evolution, distribution, and future of life in the universe. So it just was completely mind-blowing. Of course, you feel like you get thrown in the deep end of the pool because it's an extremely interdisciplinary area of science, which feeds off of inputs from physics, chemistry, biology, geology, planetary sciences, cosmology, all of that, right? So you do feel, despite you working in a specific realm, the context is vast. So you can feel a little out of sort of your depth, but it just is a matter of familiarizing yourself with the context and trying to understand it. And you very quickly realize where is it that you fit, and you can use the techniques and tools that you accumulated over your years in academia and then ask specific questions. So fell in love with the field, then went on to do another postdoc in Harvard at the Center for Systems Biology, after which in 2012, I came back to India and started the lab, the cool lab, Chemical Origins of Life lab in ESEP, Pune, and it's been a fun ride.
Absolutely. And tell us a bit about your experiences in the US and then moving to India. What was that transition like for you as a researcher working on this new field of research?
I think one thing I have to tell you that I was very lucky to meet a bunch of visionary senior scientists in the field who had this very, very important vision for where does the future of Kathit science lie. And one of these people is my spiritual mentor in Indian science, Dr. Shashidhara, and he is one of these people, other than, of course, a few other scientists, including Dr. Anand Bachawat at IISER Mohali. These people sort of could see that astrobiology is the science of the future, which was something super lacking in India during the time I was applying. So between sort of striking up some of these initial conversations with these people around a few meetings, particularly one meeting called the YIM meeting, Young Investigator meeting, which the India Bioscience team used to put together. We had one in Boston. I'd met Shashi there for the first time. We had a really long chat. I think he spent about 45 minutes, 50 minutes chatting up with me. And he was fascinated by the kind of work I was doing. And he thought it was worth for me to make a trip to India and kind of interview at IISER Pune and see how the rest of the colleagues felt about my work, so on and so forth. So I used that opportunity as a way to hit up more places that potentially was interested in my kind of work. Because at the heart of it, what I do is at the edge of geology, chemistry, and biochemistry. So I'm basically looking at the transition from non-life to life, or chemistry to biology, which has a lot of huge, crucial implications for understanding a lot of aspects about biochemistry. So some of the people who immediately got this connection invited me, and I kind of interviewed at 5 different places while I was in India. And I also attended the international YN, which happens in India, which allowed me to network with a lot of scientists back here. And and 2 places offered, Mohali and IISER. And due to a few different things that I weighed out, I ended up picking Pune just by a whisker. And I ended up joining this place. I'm still in touch with a lot of people in Mohali. But having said that, yes, I think in the IISER systems, I might have been the first astrobiologist, the sort of astrobiologist, hat-wearing astrobiologist. And since then, I've discovered more people, including yourself, who work in this much broader umbrella of astrobiology, but come at it with different kinds of tools to answer questions. And I think there are a lot of scientists in India who don't even realize that their work has implications for astrobiology. So this is something that you and I are discovering as we go, and we're trying to sort of bring these people into our group of sort of astrobiology, loosely Indian astrobiologist group. So this has been sort of exciting in that sense, but slowly more people are trying to come back. And I'm very happy to say that one of them is back in Naipur, Kolkata now, and he just started his lab. He's a chemist. So he's much more closer to my kind of research. He's a prebiotic chemist. So I think it's the prebiotic chemistry group is a super small group, but it's just beginning to grow. There's another person in Geetham University who's moved back from NIH. He's also very interested in prebiotic chemistry. So this is sort of happening in the last year, I would say. It's exciting times. But yes, astrobiology, I didn't sell myself as an astrobiologist, right? I was very wary of being considered a person who did pop science. I was told that on my face, oh, you do popular science, as if that was something bad. I'm like, it's okay. Whatever science we do, it sort of isn't in that realm, which is popularized by NASA's big name and NASA Astrobiology Institute being associated with NASA. But having said that, I sold myself as a chemical origins of life person. And only after 5 years of having settled down in India, I'm more comfortable wearing the hat of an astrobiologist. But having said that, I think it's an absolutely cool hat to wear.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think no regrets for you at all in terms of, you know, the way things have gone. And tell us now, let's jump into Ladakh now. So where does Ladakh fit into your vision and your plans of research and your initial experiences in 2016? You know, as I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were primarily a lab person before that. There was not a lot of field work happening. But right after that, you know, a lot of the work that you have worked on has been dependent on this field project that you took up in 2016.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad for this to have come about in our lives, because, I mean, I never fathomed myself as a field biologist ever. I still am a little wary of giving that term to myself because I feel like we're still amateurs. But having said that, that was a mind-blowing experience to be around people who know what field work is like. And we went as part of the geochemistry team. So we got to learn a lot from the geologists who were on the expedition, and the geochemists who also knew how to handle sample collection and sample processing while at site, so on and so forth, including Luke, Rakesh, Sanjay Shom, and all of these folks, Parag. So it was a very learning experience, and Chaitanya, Nirja, my first two students, and I learned a lot on this trip. We ended up bringing back a lot of important hot spring samples to work with. And that context might become a little more clear if I end up sharing just a little bit of a context of the kind of work we do in our lab. Can I go ahead and do that?
Sure, please do.
So let's do this. Let me know if you can see the slide here.
Yep, I can see it. You can go full screen. Yep, I see
so
it.
This is essentially the group. I mean, this is not all of them that have gone through my lab, but these are the core group of people that have helped me with getting the lab up and running over the last 9 years. A lot of them are graduate students, either PhDs or IPhDs, and here is a postdoc. And like I said, a whole bunch of undergrads have gone through our life. And the goal of the lab is to try and understand how life might have originated on the early Earth about 3.8 to 4 billion years ago. And for us to understand what do I mean by this, I need to point out that there is this very important continuum that exists between physics, chemistry, and biology. Physics is the atomic world space. Atoms come together to form molecules, which is in the realm of chemistry. And the two panels here basically show that you can actually have molecules, a lot of interesting molecules for biology form in the interstellar medium. And these smaller molecules come together to form much larger molecules, which is what we see in the realm of biology. So there should have been one very important transition that would have happened when non-life sort of became life, or when chemistry transitioned to biology. You sort of went from this monomeric space to a polymeric space, which allowed these molecules to evolve new functions and new capabilities, which was otherwise not possible in this other realm. And where do these molecules come from on early Earth about 3.84 billion years ago? It could have happened in two ways. One is called exogenous delivery, where they would have ridden meteorites and comets. It happens even today, but very early on during the early history of life on Earth, there's thought to be a period where these comets and meteorites bombarded Earth at a very constant pace, and a lot of the initial fundamental molecules, the monomeric molecules, must have ridden these entities and gotten delivered into these pools of water that was present on the early Earth. Alternatively, certain niches on terrestrial Earth, like these volcanic geothermal pools, which exist at the at the edge of volcanoes, provide a lot of interesting chemical and thermal fluxes that allow for some of the synthesis to be possible. So here is a whole bunch of molecules that can be formed in these terrestrial environments, or could have been delivered by extraterrestrial delivery. So knowing that these are possible in these two ways, one of the important things that we ask is, how did the least common denominator of all life, right from Nelson Mandela to the catfish to the giant sequoia that you see and T-Rex that you see on the slide, how did essentially these components come together to form the fundamental building blocks of life, and these are called cells. There are two kinds of cells that we see in life predominantly now, including a third domain, but I'll not get into the details. But suffice to say, it's a very complex ensemble. So how do you go from that prebiotic soup of molecules to these complex ensembles is something that we've been very interested in. And one thing to point out is that these unicellular entities, right, single-celled entities, are super badass. What do I mean by that? They can live in extreme conditions where you and I cannot survive. High UV, heat-loving, really love hot temperatures, heavy salt conditions that can be tolerated. They live in cold conditions, yeah? Having said that, one of the important things that's come about now is that the base of the tree of life is no more thought to be this one magical organism called Luca. It's more thought of as a common ancestral community of primitive cells, which are thought to be much, much more simpler and more readily assemblable from the simpler compounds. And that's what we are trying to understand in the lab. How do we make these kinds of entities from the fundamental building blocks? The outer membrane is made up of a class of molecules called lipids. It encapsulates molecules like genetic material like DNA and RNA, and minimal sort of metabolic networks that allows it to sustain and be alive. So how do these things come about? I'm happy to say that after a long period of effort where a lot of inputs from geology, chemistry, and understanding extreme life from a biology perspective has happened, we have been able to put some of these pieces together. And in the lab, we sort of use multiple tools from biochemistry, molecular biology, biophysics to answer how you go from this prebiotic soup of molecules to these ensembles called protocells. And one thing that I want to point out here is there are two niches that are thought to be very interesting in this context. One is hydrothermal vents, and the other is terrestrial geothermal pools. And this is where Ladakh comes into picture. Your terrestrial geothermal pools are an interesting geological setting that are sort of prevalent in the Ladakh area. And this is the niche that we in our lab try to simulate. Of course, we do it from a very, very sort of pure perspective when we approach it from a very chemistry-oriented place. But the kind of things that we understand in these pure reactions is important to understand how processes fundamentally work. But nothing is valid unless and until you can actually go out into a field site to a realistic analog setting, which is much more complex. You have a lot of this water interaction with the rocks here that allows for leaching of a lot of different kinds of ions. We have no clue what these slew of ions can do to some of the processes which we are interested in that would have allowed for the emergence of protocells. So in this context, we went out to Ladakh to try and bring back these hot spring water samples from 3 different hot springs, Puga, Chumatang, and Panamik. They are different in their chemical settings and in their pHs and in the temperatures. But what we have learned is that when you take the pristine laboratory experimental approach, you get a certain set of results. But once you move to analog conditions, life is different. So here are 2 other hot springs, which you also might have seen, probably the Yellowstone National Park hot spring in Kamchatka in Russia. So these are the kinds of very, very interesting geological terrestrial niches that are thought to have allowed for the transition from non-life to life, which is what basically took us to Ladakh. So I hope that sort of gives you some flavor of what we did in Ladakh.
Absolutely. And tell us some of your personal anecdotal experiences from Ladakh as well. What is it like in that absolutely crazy environment to work amongst scientists? What would a student expect on such a program?
Just expect to be blown in your mind. That is what happened to me. I've never been to Ladakh. I'd never been to Ladakh prior to this expedition. I had some notion about what is expected, and I'm not heavily into ultra preparing myself to death by reading up about different travelogues and different people's experiences, because I feel like it colors what you might end up experiencing. So I feel like it's okay to go minimally prepared and then just let yourself immerse in the experience and learn what you learn when you're there. So in that sense, all 3 of us were mostly preparing for the expedition from a scientific perspective. And then we got there, and personally, I think all 3 of us were just blown by, there's something to say about these high altitude deserts. You're about tree line. You don't see any trees. You see trees in bits and pieces. Sorry, I should correct myself, because there are valleys where it's very green, like the Nubra Valley. But then, for most part, you're going through these, you're going right by these unbelievably gorgeous rocky outcrops, hilly outcrops. and mountainous outcrops. And then there's all this ice and glaciers, and suddenly out of nowhere, you're in an area where you're seeing bubbling water. That's hot spring, right? It's just mind blowing. I'll say, be prepared to have an open mind and just come to be blown. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be fantastic. You're going to be able to learn a lot of things which we can only theoretically appreciate from conversations like the ones that we're having, or by reading some of the stuff that is out there where people talk about what fieldwork is like. But unless and until one steps out into the space and actually sort of get their hands dirty, get down to work, I don't think one experiences the crazy rush that you feel.
And how important do you think such experiences are for future students, who might be applying to your lab to do a master's project or a PhD project? How important do you think is fieldwork from that point of view?
So, given that we were never a fieldwork lab, so people without fieldwork are also most welcome. But once you go out to the field, and once you have done some of these experiments that my original mentor in the field of astrobiology, Dave Deemer, the kind of experiments he went out and did in the field, sort of when we got to see the results of that, you realize that your perspective of how you plan for an experiment, how you analyze the data, and how you interpret those results is going to be much more nuanced. It's not going to be like you wearing just the goggles of a chemist. Now you're going to start taking the Earth system's perspective into sort of view, and you're going to factor how some of those things also sort of feed into your reaction processes. So I feel like it would be great for students to have this experience to join my lab, because they will come with this sort of natural background, bring in an Earth systems perspective to the origins of life, which I think is sadly lacking in most astrobiology sort of labs too. Because, I mean, our planet is unique. It harbors life as we know it. And we know of only this planet to harbor life as we understand it to date. So it's sort of super important to understand the planetary processes that set the planet up to be able to harbor life as we understand the biochemistry.
That's right. And that's a very interesting point. So one endeavor that I have personally had, and a few of our other colleagues have had, especially at Blue Marble Space, Sanjoy Som and others, is to try and bridge the Earth community and the space community, because there's definitely not a lot of overlap that happens between people who study the Earth and the ones who study Mars or Venus or other planets, for example. And even if there is an overlap, there's a general tendency amongst students and the public to not see them both within the same framework. And questions such as the ones you try to tackle do exactly that. They try to make people understand that the more we study our own planet, the more likely we are to answer some of the questions we are framing for Mars, and vice versa. When we try to understand Mars, we tend to understand so much about it that it might backfeed into some information, because the Earth is such an active planet. There's things that might have been eroded over the past, whereas Mars gives you a glimpse into the past, and perhaps also a glimpse into the past about our own planet. Absolutely. So our own program, Earth and Space program, endeavors to do that. We try to bring the whole picture by combining the questions that we are trying and answer on Earth with the ones that we have on Mars, for example. So there's three themes: past, present, and future. The past focuses on understanding our planet, the origin of life, the formation of the Ladakh environment. So when people visit there, they'll see what had unfolded and what is kind of stored in the form of rock records and layers in front of them, and how glacial valleys had formed. And then hot springs, of course, Puga being the site where we're all excited about it being an important place for helping answer some of the questions with regards to the terrestrial origin of life. The second theme is around climate change, which is, of course, a very pertinent situation for us all to consider. We can't run away from it. Nobody can say that it's not relevant to them anymore. Absolutely. And it absolutely focuses on the current surface processes as they're taking place in the near term, mid-term, and far term, and what those processes are like. So we'll be having people who are from a present-day climate perspective, as well as ancient climate perspective, where Dr. Benita Fartial also comes in, where she talks about how ancient climates have shaped landforms. And then we have scientists who will be talking about how the last few years has seen a change atmospherically, the soil chemistry and such.
And then there's implications for life processes.
Yes,
and
yes.
life forms.
Yes, absolutely. So, what kind of role do those climatic processes play on, the sustenance of the microorganisms that are living in that extreme environment? And then there's the final theme, which so far has attracted the most amount of interest amongst the people who have signed up, is the preparation for future Mars exploration.
Perseverance.
Yes, perseverance. And we're all about it right now because we know that there's this new rover that has just landed. There's tons of experiments that are going to be happening in the next few months, coming months.
Super
And then tell us a bit about your connection with Mars scientists. You work a lot with people who have actively been a part of Mars missions. And India also in the future is planning to have further exploration of Mars. There's going to be tons of planetary science definition work that in some ways we're already kind of having our own internal discussions, but down the line there might be a possibility that the work that we're doing in Ladakh today might in fact be informing experiments that will be going to Mars. For example, the Habit instrument, which we all have spoken about, has been a successful example of an instrument that was tested from Javier Martin Torres's lab, and we'll be having a small prototype of that as well set up in this season. So that's been a successful example of how Ladakh can actually help the development of a Mars instrument. But from a scientist perspective who's been studying these different phenomena, we have seen ancient hot spring activity on Mars.
Absolutely.
So tell us a bit about. Yes.
Where Perseverance landed, it's the crater is called Jezero crater, and it is super interesting from this perspective because it's got these lovely delta deposits that are still highly preserved. And if there has been any kind of biological activity that was feasible in this kind of settings that I was talking about, I showed you these terrestrial geothermal pools where there is a lot of interesting geyser activities, where you have a lot of these interesting geological processes that sets a fantastic stage for fundamental primitive cellular entities to emerge and then evolve possibly. So if these kinds of processes happened in Mars several billions of years ago, it's sort of almost like a sort of a time frame of very early Earth environment. So we have some of the oldest, the oldest proof of life that we have now for sure, terrestrial sort of proof, is from this Dresser geyserite stromatolite deposits, which are about 3.46 billion years old. And if these kinds of fossils, molecular fossils, are probably what Perseverance is going to be looking for. It's got all of these high-end gadgets, UV-based spectrophotometers. It has some IR-based spectrophotometers, which are going to be looking for molecular signatures, which will indirectly give us a proof of whether you did have some of these prebiotic processes that I kind of talked about happen in those kinds of settings. Not just at the prebiotic level. There's a good possibility that if Mars had Mars had some minimal life that it kind of hosted at some point of time in life, which is much closer to your cyanobacterial kind of life forms and stuff. It is this Jezero crater-like niches, geological settings, which become super interesting for us to look for some of these signatures. So absolutely, when I say that I would love for students to bring in an Earth systems perspective to understand the origins of life. That is specific to what it is that we're doing in my lab, where we are trying to understand how the transition from chemistry to biology happened on the early Earth. Having said that, bringing in a planetary systems perspective to understand how life might have originated per se, irrespective of whether you're looking at Earth as a host or some other exoplanet or any other planet in our own solar system, it kind of brings in a completely different, what I would call a much more holistic perspective to try and understand some of these processes, not just to understand what it means for how we came about, but also for understanding how life might be distributed out there in the universe. And if there's life as we understand it anywhere else in the universe. Absolutely. Ladakh is crucial for these kinds of things.
And it's so much important to conserve and protect these environments and cordon off some of these areas to ensure that we preserve it for our future generations and also for the ongoing scientific activities.
Absolutely, no questions about it. And we sincerely hope that we can engage with the appropriate agencies in Ladakh and in Indian government to be able to precisely also facilitate that during these interactions and during our expeditions out to Ladakh.
And I think, so we did work with the chief wildlife warden in 2016, and even for this expedition last year, I was there, and we were very kindly accorded permission to continue our research activities. And they do have several wardens, some of them who are in charge of the Changthang region where we will be going, and they very much welcome our research. They've already been engaging a lot with other earth scientists who have been working in that environment, and I think we do plan to invite them once we are there and give them presentations, speak with them, also collect data on their behalf, because we'll anyways be collecting a lot of temperature, pressure, pH, UV kind of data throughout the 5 months that we are there. And it's going to be exciting to work closely with the wildlife department and the different, when they say wildlife, it's not just them observing and tracking the fauna or the animals and birds there, but they're very much having several people who are tracking the environment, the glaciers, the lake levels and things like that. So it's all, so far I have felt a very positive energy from their side, and we should continue to have ongoing work with them.
Absolutely.
So as one final question before we jump to Q&A, Sudha, here's a question for the travelers. So our program is not just open for students. I've mentioned this to you. There's going to be people from different walks of life who are the curious kinds, who perhaps at some point of time in their life have had these questions, and perhaps out of circumstances they've not pursued them or had a chance to make a career out of it. But every time they visit a place like Ladakh, they've come back with questions. And now here's a program for which many of them have already signed up, and there's others who are watching us and making up their minds. As a scientist, what would a person get out of learning alongside scientists? How does this affect him to be inspired and go about his own daily life? So if he, and the way I look at it is sometimes is, if I had to convince a family member of mine to come along with me, what do you have to say to them, to members of the general public, with regards to this expedition?
I mean, science is enmeshed with our lives. We sometimes don't even realize it. The fact that you and I are able to do this, and then people from across the world in principle can actually chime in and listen into this, is a product of science and technology. Science, I just can go on endlessly. Everything we do, anything that we do has been influenced by science. So science is a way of life as far as I'm concerned. It is just what everybody is a scientist unknowingly for all practical purposes. It's just that different constraints and different sort of and there are many ways of thinking about scientific questions. You can be a social scientist and think about this. You can be a natural science person, think about this. You can be an engineer and think about this. You can be any different person and then think about science and how it affects our lives, right? So having said that, working along with scientists is particularly people who actually are entrenched in that area of research, gives you a bird's eye view of what it is to actually come about with working hypotheses. How do you even start thinking about some of these things in a much more sort of scientific, you work with a lot of data that's already been generated, either experimentally or theoretically or both. And then you start building these hypotheses in a very, very logical manner. You have the main hypothesis, and then you have an alternate hypothesis, because if you're a real scientist, you know that you just don't have one hypothesis. You have multiple hypotheses that are equally or less probable, and then you work your way around it and you refine it as you go along. So the process of doing science is something that the people that come out on this expedition will learn firsthand. And this is priceless. I never went through any of these. In recent times, students have all these opportunities to do summer rotations, winter rotations, be a part of a group in principle to try and learn how science is done in that group. These things were not at all sort of an option for us when we were growing up. It was minimally available to some of the people who were in some of the really big cities in the country. But now this expedition is essentially open to anybody from across India. So it's just a matter of you wanting to do this, convincing your family that you're going to sort of do this because you want to understand how science is done in a real setting. And that is something priceless. Doing science in a laboratory setting has its own importance and relevance. And doing science out there in a field setting has its own importance and relevance. And to be able to experience it firsthand in whichever context, I think is something that is not to be taken lightly at all. It's one thing to gain your basic understanding from reading about things, but it's a completely different thing to be able to experience it firsthand. So that is something that is going to be priceless, and that is only going to be possible if you sort of come out on this expedition and hang out with us, who are the ones who are going to be there and be doing the science. And yeah, bring your folks along too, because they're going to love being in Ladakh, and they can be in Leh and enjoy some of the other things that they would like to do, which might not be very scientific, but then you can come out with us and you can be out in the actual setting doing science the way we try and understand these questions. So I hope that has answered it to some extent.
Yeah. So that definitely captured the essence of what we're all about. And, the good thing that came out of 2016 was there were so many discussions. There were so many positive energies where people, and I've realized this about Ladakh, that when you're there, you tend to zone out of your daily troubles. Everybody is together, and we had all of these interesting discussions. And there were students who, like Luke Steller, he got fired into a PhD. He just immediately decided that this is what he wanted to do. There were several careers that kind of are starting out because of that expedition. And apart from the students as well, like now that we have opened it up to people from different walks of life, who knows, there might be plans of a new startup or a new app or a new piece of technology that somebody might be able to work on, which might might be inspired by the thinking. What you rightly pointed out, it's the way we think. That's something that would be interesting for a regular traveler to come and experience and go about and apply that into whatever the other challenge that he has in his life. And
it's very important to also remember that you could be from any background, and importantly, our expedition had educators amongst us. We had science communicators in our group. We had Rakesh, who is into science photography. So we had people from these diverse sort of backgrounds who all came with this singular aim of trying to understand Ladakh as an analog setting, for trying to understand how earlier processes might have panned out, or what implications that has for our expeditions to Mars, so on and so forth. So yes, you can be, Annalie, she's an artist. She came out and she made these lovely, gorgeous, stunning illustrations of the different field sites that we were at. And it just was a beautiful experience hanging out with people from these very, very diverse backgrounds. So anything about science could interest you, and you could still be out there and learning a lot of different things from a diverse group of people.
Yeah. There's so much to talk about here. Let me jump into some of the questions that have arrived in the comments. So there's a question, Dr. Sudha, did you or anyone in your group face breathing difficulties during the field visit in 2016?
So I did. It takes a little bit of acclimatization. That's because your oxygen levels are a little more thinner when you are above a certain height, right? You're above 4,000 meters. So it becomes a little scant, because of which your lungs need to get acclimatized. So what you do is you fly into Leh, you stay there for about 2-3 days, let your physiology acclimatize to those conditions. Many people very readily acclimatize. Some of them just need a little bit more of a push, and hence we carry oxygen cylinders with us to be able to give you that extra push if required. And we had a handful of people on the expedition who needed that, and just got that for 24 hours, and we were ready to take off to the next higher level setting. So yes, there were breathing issues, but it wasn't very worrisome, and we didn't have any extreme sort of situations happen to any of us. One of the important things to do, and which is something that I did very consciously, when I knew this expedition was going to happen in August, I started seriously sort of doing a lot of exercising from April, sort of just to build my lung capacity. A lot of long walks and whatever is your favorite thing to do. So you should consider doing that. But once you've done that and you're in a reasonably healthy place, you will have to check off a few boxes, which are very, very minimal requirements. It's going to be fine. And acclimatization in Leh will help you with the oxygen level differences and your body getting used to it.
Yeah, thanks, Sudha. And so our team will ensure that the people who are applying do not have any pre-existing medical conditions. So they'll all be expected to get a doctor, their own doctors, to sign off on a medical certificate that allows them to travel. And there's a mandatory 2-day acclimatization period in Leh for them to be able to acclimatize, just like Sudha just pointed out. And there will be a traveling physician who will ensure that we'll be taking some vitals before, during, and after the expedition as well. So as a team, since 2016, we have ensured that we do not leave out on any requirement that is needed to run such an expedition. So fortunately, we've never had any such situations, and it's also been because many people have been excited and very responsible people when they were on this expedition, and not being reckless when it came to their own.
That's super crucial, very, very crucial.
So there's a lot of questions coming in. I will try and answer all of them. I will put a disclaimer here that in case we are not able to answer the questions, we will endeavor to have them responded via comments in the Facebook, because it stores as a video once we finish here. So there's a question from Suryendu. He has asked actually several questions. Suryendu is participating in this expedition. He is always on all the chats, so I'm very happy to receive his questions. Let me just paraphrase Suryendu's question and ask you. He asks about how you mentioned that life could have, in fact, started on Earth with external influences, where there's particles coming from space and then influencing the current chemistry on Earth and then converting that into biology. He wants to understand whether the similar kind of processes might have also occurred on Mars, Venus, and he also throws in exoplanets. So how likely are we to expect such, because we are going, I think what he's trying to ask is that we are going out there to look for habitable conditions where life might have independently started. But there is also the additional possibility that there has been external influences where an alien environment, which is not quote unquote habitable in our understanding, might still have life because there's been external influences coming in.
So one of the important things to remember is that the molecular inventory that I'm talking about, which would have been present in the proverbial prebiotic soup one earlier, there's possibly something that a lot of other planets in our solar system might have potentially been sort of it might have been stuff that they've seen too, because a lot of these molecules form in the interstellar medium, and they can ride on these comets and meteorites, and they can get delivered into different parts of the solar system. So what then allows for things to happen downstream is what is going to be different. So you have Mars and Earth in this beautiful sort of a space where water as a very important ingredient for life is available in liquid form. So there are a lot of these other secondary and tertiary constraints, which are both planetary in nature and other kinds of processes that are infringed upon by the chemistries that can be sustained in some of these bodies, that will then decide whether your inventory of molecules is going to be useful for any further downstream processes or not. So to simply answer the question, yes, there is a possibility that all of this inventory of molecules, a good bit of it was probably even available to Mars, which is what makes it very interesting, because we've also seen signatures of water on Mars. And now this delta region clearly shows that you did have a hot spring-like area in the Jezero crater spot. So all I'm trying to say is inventory alone is not enough. There are a lot of other important parameters that will also dictate whether you will have these processes of transition from non-life to life happen on a geological setting. And those are the things that we still are trying to pin down and understand better. So hopefully this is sort of touched upon what he wanted to understand.
Great answer, Sudha. So I'm going to club two questions now and pose this to you. So you spoke about two environments in which life potentially could have started. So is it an either or is it only one kind of a situation? And is Earth a special place or a special planet? I think just kind of clubbing two things together.
So I'll first start with the setting. So what's very interesting is both the settings are very different in their physico-chemical parameter space. The kind of physical conditions that are feasible in a certain habitat, particularly in the geothermal pool, is very different from what is possible in the hydrothermal vent. In the hydrothermal vent systems. Hydrothermal vent systems have this very important component of pressure, which completely is not present on the terrestrial geothermal atmosphere. So those kinds of parameters can have a completely different outcome for processes that can be facilitated there. And even in the hot springs that we talked about, there are actually hot springs which can be a few meters apart and can be completely different in the geochemistry that they can sustain because of the kind of rocks that they are lined with. So you have a terrestrial geothermal pool or a hot spring which is at around temperature 75 and pH 3, and just a few meters away, it's probably at around 70 to 75, but you're now at pH 7, telling you that the hydrogen ion concentration in that environment is very different. These have implications for the kind of processes that can be facilitated in these environments. So yes, the hydrothermal vent systems, which were first discovered in the late 1970s by Alvin and a lot of other colleagues, basically showed that life can thrive in these conditions. However, I feel like it is a very, very intriguing extremophile kind of a condition, but to have some of the interesting processes occur that allow for the transition from chemistry to biology, that thing where I talked about your simple molecules becoming way more complex, those are the kinds of processes which have still not been demonstrated in a clear manner in the hydrothermal vent settings. Whereas your terrestrial pool settings have a lot of interesting energy sources. You have light, you have radiation, you have heat energy from the hot spring systems, and you have all these interesting molecules that are present because of the water-rock interactions. So a lot of this provide for the starting ingredients, which then allow for formation of simpler chemical molecules and more complex biopolymers. So these are experiments. There are various experiments that have come out from a few different labs in the world that show these transitions much more clearly in a terrestrial geothermal setting. So I feel like depending upon the process that you're interested in, one setting could be more interesting than the other, but for the sake of the transition from chemistry to biology, I feel like the terrestrial geothermal pools provide a much more convincing niche than the hydrothermal vents that are on the sea floor. Having said that, you talked about a second question. I'm sorry, remind me again, what was that?
The question is Earth a special planet?
Yeah. You know, at least when sort of you have these missions go out to other planets and then they send you back pictures of the pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan called it, it feels like a bloody ultra special place. And life, the biochemistry of life as we understand it, as of today, hasn't been fully demonstrated in any other planet within our own solar system. So I feel like it's okay to feel like we are special, and I'm coming mainly from this place of preserving our planet. I think only if we make ourselves open our minds to this possibility that what happened here over billions of years is completely non-trivial, I feel like we will not take these climate change-like processes more systematically seriously. So I feel like we know for sure our planet can host life as we understand it, so we should preserve it. We should do everything to preserve it like mad. And then we should also go out there and try and look for other planets that might be able to host life to maybe not the same extent as on Earth, but a lot of interesting possibilities exist, which will allow us to sort of venture out into space, and it's the next frontier. So I feel like one needs to, the speciality of our Earth comes from that perspective, that we know of this pale blue dot as being a body that hosts life as we understand it. And for that reason, yes, it's important to preserve it to death or not to death. So,
great. So I will now club two questions and pose it again to you. So, but this will be the last question. And for some of the other questions, we'll try it. And because there's a few others coming in, and we have reached the limit of this Q&A session. So the question is from Abhigyan Saraswat. He asks, how is it possible that in a single particular area, we can find glaciers, lakes, hot springs, and all of these other natural phenomena you mentioned? And what is the relation that we find between these? Is it something that we think cannot happen, but they occur? I think he's trying to understand, because we speak about these extreme diverse environments. So how is it that there's certain parts on our planet where we tend to find, like, for example, Iceland is one such place, Ladakh is one such place, Atacama is one such place. So what is it that makes Ladakh unique in the fact that it's got all these different environments, and how is it only happening there and not anywhere else?
I think it's a very complex mix of several things coming together in that geological setting, right? You have high altitude, which allows for certain processes which cannot occur in low altitude conditions at all. You have the tallest mountains of the world present there, which also impinges on the processes that can happen in the surrounding environment. And volcanic activity, or the activity which leads to formation of hot spring-like conditions. Tectonic activity is much more rampant on Earth, but it is much more prevalent in certain parts of the Earth than the others. Like you have the Pacific Ring of Fire, which makes some of the countries that line this zone much more tectonically active than other parts of the world. So some of these very, very interesting geological processes facilitated by certain geological features is uniquely sort of come together in certain specific parts of the world, which are all high altitude deserts and Iceland-like places. So I feel like for a place like Ladakh to happen, you need some of these fundamental conditions to be in place, geological conditions in place, after which it is going to dictate the chemistry and then the biology that is possible there. And hence, Ladakh very curiously has all of these very interesting geological landforms that we are very excited about, which has implications for this primordial setting that might have allowed for lifelike processes to occur. But again, you cannot have the same setting, for example, in, say, Pune, which is where I'm sitting right now, because Pune has a very different geological sort of environment that it's surrounded by. So we cannot have, for example, giant mountains and hence no glaciers, right? High altitude. So I feel
actually, you just answered one of the questions as well, which was kind of hidden in the previous section, was there's low altitude hot springs in Maharashtra and also other parts of India. So why Ladakh? So you just answered that the high altitude environment gives that unique geochemistry. Great. So Sudha, this brings us to the close of the session. I am so glad to have received all of this. I'm actually planning on converting this also into a monthly webinar, because there's so much information that's kind of you've brought out, and perhaps we can do a part 2 where you follow on from here
and talk about the science.
And then you talk about the science, wherein you talk about the work that is being planned, and then we also have a science definition meeting, internal meeting that we'll be having next weekend. So there's going to be tons of scientific planning that's going to be happening between now and perhaps your next webinar. And I think the students who are really wired into the origin of life studies would gain a lot to know more about the work that's happening in your lab and other similar labs around the world. And we'll have several people from abroad as well who'll be remotely joining in and contributing to this discussion with regards to the exploration of Ladakh.
Absolutely.
So, thanks a lot, Sudha. That brings me to the end of this session. I encourage all the interested participants to log on to our website. It will be linked on our comments, and we look forward to hearing from you if you have any further questions. And we will be announcing the next speaker as well in the next day or so. So thank you for joining us, and have a nice weekend, everybody, and have a nice Easter Sunday.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, Anurup. Happy Easter.
Thank you.